appreciate the lead in there. You kind of muted, but I know we are waiting for other people to come in, and this is always taped on YouTube. So for those people that weren't able to make it, welcome as well. And as always, it's great to have all of you join us at Eat, Drink, and Be Catholic. It's always fun to see familiar faces. We are now on our second viewing as of the new season, and we're excited to have all of you here. And just for perspective for you, Marcus, just this goes all the way back. The beginnings and the roots of Eat, Drink, and Be Catholic go back to 2012. At that point in time, Pope Benedict had asked us to, the year of our faith, and it just dawned on me that we, we're talking about stuff on, in churches a lot, but not often, out in the streets and the places where we work and live and eat and congregate. So that was the impetus for inspiration for Eat, Drink, and Be Catholic. So, in a regular world, we would have you upstairs in the upper room at a steakhouse in downtown Milwaukee with food and drink. But this is what we are accustomed to now under our virtual world. And so it's with great delight that I welcome all of you and excited to hear from you tonight, Marcus. Thanks very much for joining us. Chad?
Thanks, Sean. Why don't we begin in prayer, and then we'll introduce our speaker for tonight. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. This prayer comes to us from Pope Francis's newest encyclical. It's at the end of his encyclical, and he says, Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world, a world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen.
Amen.
So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Over the summer, I received an email from Marcus encouraging me to check out his new book. It's called The Ethics of Encounter, and he'll be talking about that. I'm sure he sent that same email to a lot of different people. And in most cases, I would have skimmed it at best and deleted it. But there was something in the subject line was building the culture of encounter. And so I thought that's a good start because Sean and I and Michael had been talking about encounter over and over again. And with the pandemic, with the calls for racial justice, with the hyper-partisanship that we all see during this election year, this need to truly encounter people, we thought is so important to living out the gospel. And so we've been talking about that, building a schedule of events this year centered around this idea of encounter. And so Marcus was smart to throw encounter both into his book title and into the email. And so the next step was reaching out to him, buying the book, and then doing a little bit of Facebook stalking to find out that we have some mutual friends here in Milwaukee, and I'll let him tell a little of his history. But I'm so grateful to introduce to you Marcus Mescher. Marcus, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Chad. Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. I'm looking forward to our time together. I'm especially grateful to be joining you as a native Milwaukeean, a very proud Milwaukeean. I'm in my office right now here in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm associate professor of Christian ethics at Xavier University, but I'm Milwaukeean at heart. I lived in Milwaukee the first 25 years of my life, growing up on 74th and Center before my family moved up to Mequon. But my grandmother lived off the intersection of Newberry and Oakland. And so I've always had a great affinity for Three Holy Women. My parents were married in Holy Rosary Church in 1981. So I feel like a partial loyalty to the east side of Milwaukee. I went to Market High and Marquette U, and I am who I am because of those 25 years in Milwaukee and the encounters that I had growing up, and getting to know people all over the city. So I hope that our conversation tonight can be especially illuminating and relevant and meaningful for the Milwaukee community and the community of Three Holy Women.
Yeah, so I'm going to plug the book here and hold it up for people. The Ethics of Encounter. In it, you describe a key encounter in your life when you were in high school at Marquette, and I think it's pivotal to our conversation tonight. Could you just share that story of your trip to the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, so I had always been involved in service. I've been Catholic educated since I was 4, whether it was St. Pius or the parishes that are now Lumen Christi. Always gotten involved in service, but it had always been in the Milwaukee area. And then when I was at Market High, I had the opportunity to broaden my horizons and commit to doing a summer of service before the senior year of my high school year. And so there was a group of 10 of us. Then we raised $13,000 to spend the summer building a school in the Campo, the countryside in the Dominican Republic, which was going to be the only brick and mortar building for miles. And before we got to the countryside in this very rural community there where there wasn't any running water or electricity, we just got to know a little bit about the country. So we were playing tourist in the capital city, Santo Domingo, visiting this giant lighthouse that had been erected to commemorate the 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's landing on the island. And then immediately after that, driving in our air-conditioned van to the city dump. And it was a very strange experience for the 10 of us and the Jesuit priest, Father Terry Brennan, to be driving through this air-conditioned van. And I remember thinking that that was the most distance I had ever felt from the people around me. You know, here I was, a white kid from the suburbs of Milwaukee, driving in an air-conditioned van through a city dump, seeing that there were people who actually were living in the dump, and they were searching through the garbage for anything they could eat, use, or sell. And it was just a really deflating experience to see, that there were children there were women there, people of all ages, and they were trying to make a life in a garbage dump that was perpetually on fire to make room for more garbage. And we asked Father Brennan why we were here, and he explained to us that the people had previously lived where the lighthouse now stood, and their homes were razed to build this tourist attraction, and were given no other place to live. So they had no alternative but to try to build a home in a garbage dump. And no sooner did he explain that than he stopped the van and told us to get out. And we opened the van doors and just got hit with this wave of heat and stench and smoke. It was just awful. You know, our poor pink lungs were just being burned by the smoke and just the disgusting smell of garbage on fire everywhere around us. And we probably would have been pretty disgusted and morose, except we got bum rushed by all of these kids who just ran up to us like we were long lost family members. And it was the most surreal experience. You know, they didn't want anything from us. They weren't asking for handouts or anything. They just treated us like we were their cousins or their aunts or uncles. And I was a human jungle gym for the next couple hours. They just, we took them by the hands and swung them around in circles. In Spanish, it's called vuelta, where you just kind of like give a kid a little bit of a flight. I did that until I thought my arms were going to fall off. And it was this beautiful moment that I went from feeling incredibly distant from these people to then feeling this sense of belonging, and affection. And before long, a man approached Father Brennan and asked if he would bless his home. So we were walking through the garbage dump trying to find his home, seeing that, there's no sewer system. So people are, defecating in the same ditch where they're trying to draw drinking water. We saw kids who couldn't find food, and just to quell their empty stomachs, they were eating mud, just so that they wouldn't have empty stomachs anymore. And finally, after a long walk, we made it to this man's home, which was essentially just a cave in a hill of garbage. And it was divided in half by some, old blankets or old clothes. And on the right were like just a collection of soft garbage where he and his wife and his children slept. And on the left, there was nothing except for a table, a chair, and a framed picture of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which was the exact same image that was hanging up in my home parish, then St. James in Mequon, now Lumen Christi. And I'm ashamed to admit it, but it took that image for me to see that Christ was present in the garbage dump. and that these people were my equals in the eyes of God, that they were my brothers and sisters, and that we did belong to each other. I mean, they treated me that way, but I didn't see that we were equals until I saw that image. And that moment was 21 years ago, but it still feels like yesterday. And I often think about what it's like for Jesus to look through that image out into a world that is so divided, that has so many unjust inequalities, that has lost sight that we belong to each other. That's the great line from Mother Teresa that I think of all the time. If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. And that encounter changed the trajectory of the rest of my life. For the rest of my life, I wanted to figure out how do we build a world where people don't have to live in a garbage dump? How do we build a world where it's not so easy to miss out on the ways that we belong to each other? So it decided where I applied to schools and what I decided to major in, and where I studied abroad, and who I fell in love with. It decided everything in my life, and that's why I'm a college professor now. I specialize in Catholic social thought. I wrote my dissertation on the principle of solidarity, and dedicating my life's work to trying to heal the distrust, the discord, and the division that marks so many of our communities on the local, the national, and the global level.
That's an amazing story. Thank you, Marcus. I remember reading in the beginning of the book that was just, it's better hearing it live, but it was moving when I heard it. So I had the good fortune, full disclosure, my favorite parable is the prodigal son, until I read your account in chapter 2 about the Good Samaritan, which is not a parable. And as you point out, and maybe shouldn't be called the Good Samaritan in a lot of ways. And I think, pack that. But I think it's safe to say that basically it's just a story about, being, a good person, inspiring a community service, being heroic. That's essentially what it is. It's 64 pages to say just that, right? No, I know, I'm kidding. It's more than that. And it's, it was interesting. There were so many things to unpack. I told you before we started that, it was just so full of, so much to see that I had not seen before. We all know the story, mm-hmm. and yet I have so many questions, and I was just kind of blown away. But one of the things that you talked about on page 37, you said that the go and do likewise comment that Jesus made, and it was really interesting to see the interaction between the lawyer who asked the question, the way it was answered, the way it was posed, and even in the end, kind of how it, the very specific wording and how Jesus, responded to the lawyer. Jesus is a pretty brilliant guy. This Jesus guy, he's like a god. Anyway, so he says, Jesus teaches that the deepest longings of the human heart and the profoundest meaning of life are fulfilled more by doing than knowing. And then the footnote, which there's a few in the book, says Luke's view that disciples ought to focus on doing the law rather than discussing it. So the reward for doing is living well. Can you talk a little bit about that? I'm just going off script, Chad, on our questions, but I threw you a zinger out of the get-go. So.
Yeah, no, I think this is something that I learned from the Jesuits at Marquette High and Marquette U, that, we're trying to be men and women for and with others, to live a faith that does justice. And that's something that has really deepened my own faith. And so when I started reading more about this story, it seemed to resonate with my sense of, who Jesus reveals, who God is, and what God wants for and from us. But I think you're right, Sean. I think the fact that the Good Samaritan might be Jesus' best known parable has meant that for a lot of people it's been domesticated, and we do water it down to, Jesus just wants us to do service or to help those in need. Or if if you see someone in an emergency, you pull over on the side of the road and you offer them help, and then you're the Good Samaritan. And I think we have to pay attention to what the lawyer is doing there. There's a lot in this story that I think we miss if we don't pay attention. And the way that it's framed, right? The lawyer asks Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Which is the most important question a Jewish person could ask, right? There's nothing more important than inheriting eternal life. And Jesus does this thing that we don't expect. He turns the question back on his interlocutor, right? He's empowering his interlocutor who's trying to trap him. And he says, "How do you read it? Okay, smarty pants, you're the lawyer, you tell me." And what the lawyer does had never happened before, ever. Like this is brand new. The lawyer takes the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:5, which is supposed to be on the lips of a pious Jew at all times, right? That I'm going to love the Lord my God with all my strength, with all my mind, with all my heart, right? Takes that line from Deuteronomy 6:5 and then combines it with Leviticus 19:18 to love your neighbor as yourself, right? These two very different passages, far apart in the Torah, and puts them together and makes them one commandment, right? This is unique in Luke's gospel. In John, there's no commandment to love God. We just get Jesus telling us, I give you a new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And in Mark and Matthew, there's a hierarchy. First you love God, then you love your neighbor. But in Luke, we have this new thing, thanks to this conversation, this encounter that Jesus has with the lawyer. And Jesus says, you've answered correctly, do this and you will live. So it's not enough to know that we have to love God and neighbor, we have to actually do it. And now the lawyer's a little bit embarrassed because he's been put in this place a little bit. And he says, okay, now who is my neighbor? Which again, like to our ears, seems like a pretty innocent question, but it's not, right? It's a limit-seeking question. It's, it implies there's a non-neighbor. There's someone that is beyond my religious scope and my moral concern. And that's the whole point of the story, right? Jesus takes that question, who's my neighbor, and uses it to explode the category of neighbor so that we see that there are no non-neighbors, that everyone is to be understood as neighbor. But not only that, right? Because, to your point, at the end of the story, when Jesus gets to the end, he turns back to the lawyer and he says, now who was neighbor to the man who was beaten, robbed, and left for dead? Changing the category of neighbor, an object, onto me, right? Someone that I might have obligations to a proactively loving subject, right? To be neighbor, that's the task. And I don't know how many of us really sit with, who are those people that I am neighbor to, but who are those people that maybe I'm unwilling to draw near, to be nearby? That's where we get the word neighbor, the one who is nearby. Mm-hmm. And again, when Jesus is telling this story, he locates it in a very specific social context, right? Jesus doesn't give him the definition of a lawyer. He tells a story because we remember stories well. I mean, our brain actually has a special thing that happens. Whenever you hear a story, there are like three things that are happening. The first is you imagine yourself in that situation. The second is your brain is scanning your memories for anything that can help you resonate or connect with it. And then the third thing is that your brain actually starts to record the story. So I imagine in a couple of weeks from now, if you happen to mention that you tuned in for this session, you probably won't remember anything that I say, but you might remember the story that I started out with in the garbage dump in the Dominican Republic. That's how our brains work. And I think you're right. Jesus was a master storyteller, and he knew that these stories would be worth remembering and passing down. This is the only story that Jesus tells that is socially located. And if you've never been to the Holy Land, you might not know why it matters that this is a story about a road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Jerusalem's up a city on a hill, and it's the center of religion. Jericho is 2,000 feet lower in elevation and is the center of commerce. So to get from that height to the low point, there are all these switchback curves. And because it's the center of commerce, that means the people who are traveling have a lot of money on them, right? Either because they're going to buy something or they've just sold something. So that road from Jerusalem to Jericho was notoriously unsafe. So Jesus' audience has zero sympathy for the man who's beaten, robbed, and left for dead. He got what was coming for him. You don't travel that road by yourself, right? And then when we think about that, we also think about, what was it like for that man to travel that road? He probably knew better, but he probably was pretty desperate and didn't have any alternative, right? And then Jesus says there's some people who pass by and see him, the priest and the Levite, right, who are charged with following the Torah, which tells us that if you ever encounter someone in need, taking care of that person supersedes all other commitments. So I've heard some bad homilies on this parable that excuse the priest and the Levite, and that's not true. I mean, the Torah is explicit that in a life or death situation, you coming to the aid of another person is the greatest commandment. That is your greatest obligation. And the priest and Levite, they don't even check on the guy to see if he's alive or dead. The Torah also teaches that if you come across a corpse, you have to cover the corpse to show respect for the dead. They can't be bothered. You know, they have their agenda or their to-do list or whatever it is. And the Greek actually says when they see the man in the ditch, they go to the other side of the road. They create more distance between themselves and the man who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. So they become, in effect, the anti-neighbor, right? And that's important, because I think for a lot of people, we think that there are people who are holy, and then there's the rest of us. You know, that there are saints and there are sinners, and Jesus is exploding those categories for us, right? Like there aren't saints and sinners, or the pious and the rest of us. We're all sinners who are called to be saints. And to prove that point, he makes the third person, you know, to pass by on the road, a Samaritan. Now, Jesus' audience is expecting, all right, if we've got a priest and a Levite, the third figure, you know, they think he's setting up a joke here, right? The third figure is going to be a lay Israelite, you know, so, all right, the lay person does what our religious leaders don't do, we get it. But instead he says Samaritan. And again, because this story is so domesticated or so familiar, we hear Samaritan, we're like, okay, here comes the hero. Right? Like there's Good Samaritan Hospital or Good Samaritan Soup Kitchen or whatever. We know that to be a Samaritan is to be someone who's generous or kind, right? But for the local community, for Jesus' original audience, the Samaritan would have been the most despised outcast they could imagine. It's really hard to come up with a contemporary analogy, but you have to imagine someone who makes your skin crawl or your stomach turn. You know, like a pedophile, like someone that you think is beyond redemption, someone that you would never want to associate with. In fact, the biblical commentators say that if that man who'd been beaten, robbed, and left for dead had been conscious, he would have preferred death than to have had the Samaritan draw near to him. So Jesus' audience is disgusted that the Samaritan is now part of the story, right? Like this isn't all that foreign to us, given all the, you know, the derision and the scorn and the contempt in so many political factions in our country. But in Jesus' audience, they could not have imagined a worse character than the Samaritan. And what happens? Again, if you read the Greek carefully, it says that he spied the man in the ditch and his heart melted. Or another translation would be that his bowels were wrenched. So he has this visceral connection. And maybe because he is a despised outcast, it's easier for him to relate to the man who's been beaten, robbed, and left for dead. He knows what that's like, to be vulnerable, or to be exploited, or to be excluded. And he moves into the ditch, even though as a despised outcast on a very dangerous road, that's a dumb thing to do, right? In fact, in one of the footnotes, I think that I suggest this story would be better called the story of the foolish Samaritan, right? Like nothing he does here is prudent, but the gratuitousness of his actions, the courage and the compassion that he models, this is how Jesus is blowing up that question of who is my neighbor. Jesus just says, I don't know what you're talking about. That's absolutely the wrong question to be asking. The question isn't who is my neighbor, it's to whom are we neighbors, and to whom do we fail to be neighbors, right? So the Samaritan goes into the ditch, draws near to this man, even though it could be an ambush, right? He could be beaten and robbed and left for dead. He doesn't know what he's going to find in that ditch. And he pours oil and wine on his wounds, which is evocative of the exact same thing that the priest and the Levite do in the temple. They use oil and wine for their religious ceremonies. So what they're doing in an act of piety, the Samaritan does in an act of mercy, which should remind us, you know, what we hear from the prophet Hosea and in other passages in Jesus' own teaching, when Jesus says, I prefer not sacrifice, but mercy. Mm-hmm. And that's what really got me thinking about this passage more and more, especially after Pope Francis's emphasis on the Jubilee of Mercy, where he says that mercy is God's identity card. You know, if we want to know who God is and what God wants, the answer is mercy. And the Samaritan does that. He models that with that tenderness in the ditch, and then puts him on his animal, takes him to an inn where, again, all eyes are on him. You know, like I think, you know, one approximation of this story is that's like a Plains Indian bringing a scalped cowboy on the back of his horse into a saloon, right? The inn was just, I mean, that's where no good people hung out and got drunk. I mean, the courage that it took to bring the man into an inn and then to pony up the dough and say, all right, I'm going to enlist you in his convalescence. here's enough money for 2 weeks care, and if this isn't enough money, I'll be back to pay the remainder. So we see all of these traits, right? The courage, the compassion, the generosity, but also I think something we miss too in the story is the humility. And not humility as in like humiliation to make us feel bad, but humility, Thomas Aquinas tells us, is the virtue of being able to tell the truth about ourselves, right? To see the good, but also to see the limitation and also to see the sin. The Samaritan doesn't quit his job. He doesn't leave his family. He doesn't set up the Jericho Road Improvement Association and ensure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. He does what he can, but no more and no less. And I think that's the invitation for us, right? What is the good that we can do? And not having an unrealistic ideal imposed on our shoulders, but also not letting ourselves off the hook too easily, right? I think that's what the priest and Levite do, right? They make excuses. They look the other way. Pope Francis talks about that as the globalization of indifference, where we just can't be bothered. That was one of the definitions of sin that I learned in graduate school. Jim Keenan, who's a Jesuit priest, says that sin is the failure to bother to love God, neighbor, and ourselves, right? And we see that in the priest and the Levite. And if we look honestly at this story, we probably see that in ourselves. And in fact, in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis makes that observation. He says, in looking at this story, there is something in all of us that resembles the man who's been beaten and robbed and left for dead, who relies on other people. There's something in all of us of the robbers, the people that we maybe exploit or take advantage of or benefit from in some way. There's the priest and the Levite in all of us, where we just say, I can't, this is too much, or we focus on our own agenda. And also, there's something in the Samaritan in us. And I think that the Samaritan there, by showing us this act of humility, invites us to think about, all right, how do I do my part? And then the final characteristic of fidelity, inviting the inn to the owner of the inn to be a part of this, to try to heal that broken relationship between Jews and Samaritans, to try to remind us that we do belong to each other. Jesus turns back to the lawyer and says, okay, who was neighbor to the man who's being robbed and left for dead? And the lawyer is so embarrassed he can't even bring himself to say the word Samaritan. So he says, the one who treated him with mercy. And Jesus says, go and do likewise, which is really the key to the whole story, right? It's not go and do exactly the same. Jesus doesn't expect that it's tenable, that we can actually help every person that we come into contact with. But doing likewise is an invitation to use our imagination, to put ourselves in the story, and to imagine how can we follow those characteristics of the Samaritan in our own way and in our own place.
The interesting, I'm glad you brought up the lawyer piece, because he almost couldn't say the word, couldn't say the name of when asked, and I never saw that until you said the one who showed mercy, which seemed like a very, logical answer, but it was like, there's more to that when you really unpack it. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about this. You talked about in the book, just the comparison quickly about Matthew 25 as it relates to Luke 10 in the sense of the juxtaposition. Both kind of lay it out, right? And Jesus in this story sort of allows us to see ourselves as it relates to showing to encounters and showing mercy.
Yeah. No, that's a great connection, Sean, because I think in both cases, right, the stories are framed with eternal life and with salvation, right? That's the lawyer's question to Jesus in Luke 10, and in Matthew 25, this is his last sermon before he is handed over and killed. So, scholars tell us this is the summation of everything Jesus came to tell us, and it's the story of the separation of the sheep and the goats. The kicker there, the sheep are saved. Yeah, we get that. And the goats are not. And we get that. But the sheep don't know they're sheep. And the goats don't know they're goats, right? Like, this is a surprise to them. And what determines the sheep from the goats is not their piety. It's not how much they gave to church, or how often they prayed the rosary, or often they went to temple, right? The sheep are sheep because of what Jesus says, right? I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was in prison and you visited me. And the sheep look around and they say, what are you talking about? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or naked or a stranger or in prison? And Jesus gives us that powerful line in Matthew 25:40, what you do for the least of your brothers and sisters, you do for me, where Jesus identifies himself with the least, the lost, and the lowly. And then he turns to the goats and said, hey, I was hungry, thirsty, naked, a stranger, and in prison, and you did nothing for me. And the goats are like, what are you talking about, right? Like, and she says, what you don't do for your brothers and sisters, the least of your brothers and sisters, you do not do for me. And why I think those stories where they both connect is, if we don't go out of our way and into the ditch, like the Samaritan, we don't know the needs of others, right? If we just stay in our lane, if we just follow our own agenda, if we just work through our own to-do list, we will be totally ignorant and oblivious to the needs of other people. So what both stories point to is that requirement that we change our social location, that we draw near to people who are suffering, the people who feel invisible and unheard. And we don't have to go far, right? Like, I know we started the story about my experience with Market High and the Dominican Republic, but I mean, man, being a native of Milwaukee, I know there's so many neighborhoods in need in Milwaukee. And I'm not just talking about, in terms of poverty, I'm talking about everywhere. After I graduated from Marquette, I worked as a youth minister for St. Mary's in Elm Grove and St. Joe's in Wauwatosa. And I was trying to get my students involved in service all the time. And it was unbelievable to me that even with a lot of economic privilege in some of those neighborhoods, there was still profound amounts of loneliness, profound amounts of people who felt neglected or who felt like they didn't count, they didn't belong, they didn't matter, who had great needs, both spiritually, but also materially, right? So I think that's the invitation, is that we draw near and we take up a vantage point that isn't our own. And that changes what we see, when we take up a position other than our own. And I had shared, I have 2 videos to illustrate this. I'm a visual person, so it helps me if I have a visual cue. But I really love this statue. This comes from a public installation art, if you can see this, in Paris, where, oh man, Facebook's gonna give me an ad in the middle of this. Are you kidding me? Geez. All right, let's see if I can. Well, I'll do this one instead. Okay, so this looks like a square, right? But if you turn around, this is another piece of artwork I think is super interesting. If you change your feet, if you move your social location, you see that it's not just a square. Now it's actually a circle. And let's see if I can get this. Okay, so this is an elephant now, but at the very beginning of the video, you see that this is these are 2 giraffes. So I'm going to try to circumvent the ad there by just skipping around. So you see 2 giraffes now, but if you move 90 degrees, now you see an elephant, right? Like, and you could imagine someone standing 90 degrees away from each other, 2 people standing 90 degrees away from each other and getting into an argument. That's an elephant. No, it's 2 giraffes, right? Like, and they would be most certain that they were right. And there's probably nothing you could do to convince them that there was something more there unless they moved their feet. And I think that's the invitation here, not just so that we can think about the people that we encounter and trying to be able to be more attentive and responsive to their needs, but also to be reflective on, if we never move our feet, who are the people that we fail to encounter? My mom went to Riverside High School, and she always talked about like what an eye-opening experience that was for her. My dad went to Mescher, and again, like the friends that he made, that got him into not just perspectives other than his own, but it helped him build friendships with people who had, very different lives, politically, economically, racially, right? And I think that's really the invitation, and that's where I try to move the book, just from that once episode of encounter on the side of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, to trying to imagine relationships that invite us to cross those barriers, across the color line or the class line or the party line or the religious line, and to cultivate friendships. Because this is not my novel insight. Bill Shakespeare said this a long time ago: tell me who your friends are and I'll tell you who you are, right? Like our friends form us. And who we are is a direct result of the friendships that we have. And our friends' problems become our problems. And I think that's the invitation, both in Luke 10 and in Matthew 25, to cultivate friendships with people who are on the margins, who feel invisible and unheard. Because not only will that change us, but it also, I think, give us a sense of, wanting to put some skin in the game to do something about the problems that our friends are facing. I know for me, that came home in a special way when I was in college. I was at Marquette U. I was working as an RA to help pay for school. And I was living in East Hall, and now it's Straz Tower on like 10th and Wisconsin, that old YMCA building, which was beautiful. It was remodeled right before I moved in. Because it was the old Y, we had basketball courts and a swimming pool and the best food on campus. Man, I had it really good. In fact, I didn't leave that building for all 4 years. I lived there freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, and senior year. And I had it great. But every Friday night, or almost every Friday night, I'd go to St. Ben's, on 9th and State. And it was humbling, that week after week to share life with people who didn't have the things that I could take for granted. And that experience of serving week after week at St. Ben's was totally different than, walking to class and getting panhandled. And, that kind of burst my bubble. And when you go to high school in 35th in Wisconsin, that's going to burst your bubble too. But the building relationships, there was one man in particular that I got to know through my time in college, and then when I was a youth minister at St. Mary's and St. Joe's, and then bringing teenagers from Elm Grove and Brookfield and Tosa down to St. Ben's. His name was Robert, and he was someone who was experiencing homelessness, and he wore all of his clothes and had all of his belongings with him all of the time. It didn't matter if it was freezing cold or blazing hot. He always had all of his belongings, and they were always on his body. And I had become friends with Robert over my time at Marquette U, but then once I graduated and I started bringing teenagers with me, he got like super excited, to see me, and he'd always like come and find me. And initially I had to kind of brace myself because he smelled like urine, or alcohol. And it wasn't always a pleasant experience. And to be honest with you, there were times where I probably tried to hide behind the food line or wash dishes in the kitchen, or I avoided him sometimes because it was a little bit uncomfortable. And I didn't understand why he was so happy to see me, or, when I was a college student, why he wanted to know what classes I was taking, or, how my studies were going. I thought it was a little bit odd how interested he was in my life. But after the course of those 7 years of walking with each other and getting to know him, I finally got to learn his story. And again, I'm embarrassed that it took basically until I was ready to move to Boston and begin my graduate studies in theology that I really got to know the whole story. And I learned that Robert actually had been a professor at Marquette U, and he didn't get tenure. And when he didn't get tenure, he lost his job. I mean, I didn't realize this, but it's not like you don't get tenure and then you just come back next year, but you don't have job security. You're out on the street. And that's what happened to Robert. He was out on the street. He lost his job. He lost his health care. He got very sick. And he lost basically all his life savings trying to pay his medical bills. And Robert's story isn't unique. 1 in 5 Americans are carrying huge medical debt. But Robert went into a downward spiral because of the pain. He started to drink. His wife took their kids and left him. And he went from someone who could have been my professor to someone who was without shelter and living on the streets of Milwaukee, just blocks from my very cozy and cushy place at Marquette U. And I never thought about that. I never forgot about Robert after all of those years, and especially working through my master's and my PhD, and I just was awarded tenure last year. I've always thought about Robert and all the people who never got to where I got. And I feel accountable to them. I feel accountable to the people in the garbage dump. And I think that's the invitation in Luke 10 and Matthew 25 is to think about what do we owe our brothers and sisters who've been kind of victim to what Pope Francis calls this throwaway culture, the people who get discarded or pushed to the margins or beyond our consciousness. And I think that's the invitation. It's not just thinking about encounter in terms of the people we ordinarily come into contact with, but trying to stretch, broaden our horizons to reach across those differences and break out of our bubbles where a lot of people look like us or think like us.
Well, I think that's where you talk a lot about the difference between charity and solidarity. And you quoted Jim Keenan, and I think it's him who, when you talked about mercy, I think his definition of mercy is entering into the chaos of another person's life. And I use it all the time when we talk about the works of mercy. Mm-hmm. And it's, in some ways, it's easier and natural to say, well, I need to be at arm's length. I can help out. I can write a check. I can hand you some money so that you'll get away from me. But that entering in, that mercy, that entering into the chaos, that recognizing that we're connected and your chaos impacts me, and my life, there's a responsibility to you, I think speaks to the solidarity that you write about that is different than just what we normally think of in terms of charity.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, Chad. I mean, I think part of growing up in Mequon and going to Market High, Market U is that I internalized a little bit of the white savior complex, you know, the here I am to save the day, or we're going to feel sorry for these people. I even noticed this today in myself with Veterans Day. And my first thought was to just the huge fraction of people who are experiencing homelessness who are vets, or the fact that 20 vets die by suicide every day. And my first thought was one of pity. And I think when we can catch ourselves with pity, then we can try to interrupt that top-down kind of horizontal feeling sorry for. Brene Brown has this great illustration of the difference between sympathy and empathy, and it's, you know, someone looking at, you know, at the surface of someone else who's down in a pit and saying, oh gosh, that's terrible that you're down there. I'm so sorry that you're stuck in that pit. You know, I feel terrible for you. That's sympathy or pity, right? But the empathy is actually going down into the pit and saying, I'm here with you. And that is solidarity, right? It's trying to move from that horizontal kind of feeling sorry for to the vertical feeling sorry for to the horizontal of trying to reaffirm our equality and to show up to each other as equals in God's eyes. And to recognize that there are real inequalities in the world, and we're not going to be able to whitewash over those differences. One of my good friends when I was a Market High student was African American, and his name's Alex, and I learned so much about racism just being Alex's friend, and the white privilege that I was totally oblivious to, just because he told me what it was like to walk into, you know, a store at Bayshore and have all the security guards' eyes just locked in on him, just waiting for him to take something off a rack. And one night we were coming home from a movie. I think we were watching American History X at the Downer, and we were taking Lake Drive home back to Mequon, and I was making fun of him because he was going 25 miles an hour on Lake Drive, and I never go 25 miles an hour on Lake Drive. And I was, you know, giving him a hard time. Why are you going 25, Grandpa? Like, it's going to take forever for us to get home. And Alex told me that if he goes 26, if he goes 27, whether it's Lake Drive or Mequon Road, he gets pulled over. And after that, I started to pay attention, you know, who were the people getting pulled over on Mequon Road. And even this happened when I was in high school. We had a priest from Africa at Lumen Christi Church, and he complained that almost every week he'd get pulled over by the Mequon police because he was an African where, you know, people didn't expect an African. And so I think, you know, I'm never going to be a person of color, and I can't pretend that I can just, like, you know, reject or ignore my white privilege, the fact that I get benefit of the doubt just because I'm a white guy. But I think having those friendships, sharing life together across those differences, it gives me a lot more empathy for what people of color experience on a daily basis and how exhausting it is to keep showing up and to keep trying to give people the benefit of the doubt when that's not always extended to them. And then to try to connect it from just like the interpersonal interaction to then kind of the structural levels, the trying to be an advocate for justice, to try to make a more level playing field, to try to account for some of those unjust inequalities and to say, you know, like, I'm with you here as an ally or as a partner in trying to build a more equitable and inclusive and just community.
Yeah, I just the comment they made, it reminded me of some of the comments about being in the ditch, actually being in the ditch. That Brene Brown is an example of that, and that social location. In fact, we talked a little bit about this last time we were together. You didn't hear this, but, you know, it's on YouTube if you want to watch it, just to check my math on it. But we talked about woundedness, and in Greg's Boyle story on page 140, he talked about Sergio. His story in your book, we talked in our last session. And isn't it interesting? Robert wore a lot of clothes. I mean, practicality, had to keep those clothes because that's what kept him. That was his possessions. But Sergio wore those same multiple shirts to hide the wounds, but both wounded, and unless we're able to kind of, you know, accept our woundedness, we cannot help others. And it's just, you know, I love the idea that, you know, to get down with the wounded, how, you know, forces us to acknowledge our own woundedness. Mm-hmm. And before we started this, you know, preparing for this, one of the things that I thought about with the Good Samaritan, going back to him, was the Samaritan probably knew, you know, what it like to be excluded. He probably was wounded. And that notion of the wounded healer sometimes are more apt at being able to get down into the ditch with other people And maybe those encounters help us to sort of recognize our own woundedness and being better at responding, was one of the things that I unpacked from all this too.
Yeah, and I think that that's so important, because I think whenever we see the bluster, whether it's in the political arena or on social media, I think we have to see that as a cover for an insecurity, that people are covering those wounds, that they are afraid of being on the wrong side or the losing side, and so they compensate by all the self-righteousness or the triumphalism, and I think that's why I draw on Greg Boyle, at the end of chapter 4 as an example of someone who tries to draw us near the wound, because you can't heal wounds if you ignore them, if you pretend they're not there. And I think that's really what our country needs right now is a whole lot of wounding. And instead of emphasizing how great we were, how great we are, how great we should be, right, to think about, boy, we have also gotten things really wrong. That's not to make anyone feel ashamed of being an American, but it is to kind of draw near to those who are wounded and to say, we see you, we hear you, you do matter, and we're with you, right? And to embrace each other in our own woundedness, right? Like, because no one gets through life without getting wounded in some way. And I think if we try to do this on our own, there's a temptation either to ignore the wounds or to wallow in them. And I think, again, like, this is why relationships are so important. And this is one of the things that I love about being Catholic, is that call to not just go to church, but to be church, right? Like we have to be church for and with each other in a way that offers both support, but also accountability. So that if we get mired, if we get stuck, that we do have to hold each other lovingly accountable to say, no, we have to keep going, we have to press on. But then when we don't think it is possible to press on, that there are people who can pick us up and carry us, that we do this together, that this is work that we do for and with each other, which we don't get modeled for us well in our culture, right? We live in a culture that tells us to hide our wounds or ignore our wounds, or to present our absolute best face on social media and make everyone think that our life is just perfect. And I think that only advances the social isolation and the loneliness. And we've got to find ways to help people see that they don't have to pretend, that they can be honest, they can be vulnerable, that they can be authentic. But the only way that they're going to do that is if they feel a sense of safety and trust, right? No one's going to kind of drop the veil and let us into those wounds if they think it's going to be used against them, or if they're going to be ridiculed or mocked. And I think that's the task right now for us, not just on social media, but in our relationships, just given how much everyone is carrying through the pandemic and just getting through this election season. But to think about, who are the people in our lives that we need to really kind of double down on making sure they feel safe and to feel a sense of trust so that they can let us into what they're carrying, because everyone's carrying a burden, and just because some people carry it well doesn't mean it's not heavy. But I think that's the invitation for us, is to figure out, like, how can we try to tune in to those burdens so that we can show each other, you're not alone in this. We carry this load together, and the burden is made easier when we carry it together.
Sean and I have a couple other questions, but while we're doing that, I also want to invite anyone on the call, if you have questions, if you want to open up your chat box, I know you're muted, but if you want to type some things in the chat box, I have you muted so that from a video point of view, I want to respect your privacy, that if you don't want to be on YouTube, you don't have to be. But if you want to type something in the chat box, and then I can unmute you, you can ask it. While you're doing that, if you have questions, one of the things that I wanted to ask has to do with hope. I mean, I think you brought up all the different ways that many of us are very overwhelmed, both with the pandemic. I know you and I have talked about, moving our kids home in terms of schooling and figuring out work, and obviously the election and now the aftermath, and trying to figure out what's going on, and either dealing with disappointment if our candidate didn't win, or dealing with uncertainty if ours did, of what's going to happen next. What are some signs of hope that you see, or movements that you see where people are living out or trying to enact some of what you present in terms of a culture of encounter?
Yeah, I think the hope is absolutely important. And I end the book focusing on hope. But I want to just quickly contest something that you said because of the way that you said it, like our candidate won or lost. I think that's part of the problem when we put on these macro level identities and we kind of see our identity tied to whether or not we're on the winning side or the losing side. And that I think is really important right now because, the election was 8 days ago and we have all these maps of red states and blue states. That is nonsense, right? Like there are no red states, there are no blue states, there are no red individuals, there are no blue individuals. Well, maybe there are a very few, but 25% of Americans identify as Republican, 31% of Americans identify as Democrat, but 40% of Americans identify as independent. Like there are a lot of people who aren't satisfied with either party. And so I think we have to be careful about thinking about all those macro level identities that we put on that feed into those us versus them categories. I know when you and I met for the first time a couple months ago, Chad, I saw all that Cubs paraphernalia behind you. And it made my stomach turn, as a Milwaukeean, as a very proud Brewers fan, as a Packer fan, right? Like, I don't want to see all that Chicago stuff. Right. And my initial impression of you was like, oh man, here's a Cubs fan, right? Like,
I'm really trying to test out your theory of encounter. Is he really willing to come down to the ditch with me?
But, then I remembered, going to Marquette U, I have a lot of friends who are Cubs fans. And, my in-laws live in Naperville and my father-in-law is, from Chicago, right? Like there are good people who cheer for different teams, right? Like, and I think that, I'm trying to be lighthearted about it, but I think it is important that we don't just see someone and see Republican or Democrat or Cubs fan or Packer fan or Bears fan, whatever it is, right? Like we are more than any one thing about us. And I think that's something that's work that we all have to do so that we move past the simplistic stereotypes and that we get to know people and like the Samaritan, try to connect on that human level. It's not about Jews and Samaritans, right? Like it's about you're human, I'm human. There is no us and them. There is only us. We've got to get there. And I think that's what I try to carry forward with, encounter as an act that leads us to more inclusive belonging. That is a practice of hope, that to look for those ways that we can connect across those differences. I certainly see hope all the time in my classroom, where I have students who model openness to growth, who really are curious and model that kind of humility to be okay with what they don't know. That's a scary thing to say, I am not an expert about this, or I don't know everything. And it's not something that Americans are good at. Sean, I don't know if you caught this footnote, but this was among my favorite research findings in my book, doing research for my book. When Americans are presented with facts that contradict our opinions, Americans, instead of reconsidering our opinion, we double down on our opinion, right? Like we get more entrenched in our viewpoint. It's like, no, I don't want to believe that evidence, right? Like I'm right, the science is wrong. I just think that's fascinating. There's something about being an American where we want to be right. We want to have the answers. But I think underneath that is an insecurity that we're afraid of what it means to not be an expert or not to know all the right answers. And you can see that in the lawyer, right? Like the lawyer's embarrassed when he's done this new thing, put Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18 together. And Jesus says, okay, yeah, now do it and you'll be all right. I'm like, oh man, like I thought I did something great and it's not enough. And I'm not saying that we have to keep measuring and, it's never enough. That's not the answer. But I do think we all can embrace this invitation to listen and learn from each other. I certainly see it in the classroom. I certainly see it in a lot of spaces online, that I think, especially in the hands of young people, that they use TikTok and Twitter and Snapchat to share life. I was in El Salvador over spring break, bringing students down to learn about Oscar Romero right before the 40th anniversary of his assassination. And COVID hit, and we got on the last flight from San Salvador back to the States. And my students still stay connected with the college students we met at the Jesuit University in El Salvador. They connect over Instagram, they connect over FaceTime, and they continue to share life together. That they built a bond that really matters to them. And I think those are the kinds of things that build hope. I think parishes at their best are this, right? Like and it's hard during a pandemic when we can't physically share life together. But even something like this, where people, that you could be watching anything tonight or reading or, going for a walk or whatever it might be. But I think the invitation to say, I'm curious about this, or I want to know more, Or I want to be reflective on the encounters that I have and how well I am attentive and responsive to the needs of others. Or to think, boy, who are those people that aren't on my radar? Who are the people that might question if they count, if they matter, if they belong in my life? I think those are things that give us hope. And I think people are looking for answers. I think they not answers in like, oh, I've got all the answers, but like, okay, what's the way forward? People are really dissatisfied with the political polarization. 9 in 10 Americans say the country is more divided now than at any point in recent memory, and that they hate it. They hate the polarization. So I think the desire is there that something else is possible. And hopefully, when we imagine who we want to be on the other side of the pandemic, when it will be safe for us to gather together in person again, that we can think about, what are we going to change? What are we going to do differently? How are we going to encounter other people differently? How are we going to listen to other people differently, so that we can really bask in the gift of being in relationship with each other? And I am more me because of the encounters I've had. And I'm sure if you reflect in your life, that's true for you too, right? Like, you are more you because of the encounters that you have in your relationships. And I think part of what's been so hard about the last 7-8 months of the pandemic is that we're getting deprived of those things that have helped to make us the persons that we are. We're not as easily in touch with the people who love us and whom we love. And I hope that this is kind of like an incubation period for us in some ways, that we think about, okay, who do we want to be on the other side? Like that, there's a saying among counselors, if you don't transform the pain, you will transmit it. So I think I've been thinking a lot about transformation and how that will be possible. And I think, the caterpillar that becomes a butterfly is a good example of that. I don't know if you know this, but when a caterpillar goes into the chrysalis and awaits the time to become a butterfly, it actually becomes mush. Like, it becomes goo. It becomes something that is unrecognizable. And then it begins the work of becoming a butterfly. And I think maybe for us living in the pandemic, this is our goo period, where this isn't really pleasant. We're being dislocated from our roles and routines and relationships. The rhythm of life is interrupted. But maybe if this is time where we can do that inner work, because I think encountering others requires a lot of inner work. I use that line from C.S. Lewis, next to the Blessed Sacrament, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Maybe this can be the time where we do that inner work to figure out, like, okay, how am I going to encounter other people as sacred and not just a coworker or a neighbor or a friend or a family member?
One of the things I like that you just talked about is the benefits of technology. I mean, we've all heard, and I lament it all the time, the ways in which technology can be divisive or it can distract, but you brought up really ways that it connects as well. And obviously we're all here because of technology here on this call. What are some guidelines you would give people in terms of how to make sure technology can be a healthy tool as opposed to a divisive or isolating one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I think we have to be more intentional about the way that we use these tools. I mean, but even before the pandemic, parents were spending more time with screens than they were with their kids. Even more times watching Netflix than they were interacting with their kids. It can be a time suck or a distraction. And studies show, I mean, psychologists tell us actually, the more time we spend on social media, the higher the rates of feeling anxious, depressed, and lonely. And I think there's a lot of that age-old compare and despair dynamic going on, where, boy, I sure wish I was with Jim and Cecilia in Florida right now. Those pictures of the palm trees and the sunsets makes me feel pretty crappy about being in Cincinnati. I mean, as someone who lived in Milwaukee for 25 years and got to enjoy Lake Michigan, I miss water. I mean, my boys, I have 3 children, but my boys call the Ohio River the nasty Ohio River every time it's in sight, because it's brown. It doesn't do anything for us. And that compare and just, I think there's something in it that's pretty human, but we also have to figure out those ways that we can resist that temptation to measure ourselves in comparison to other people. I think, so we have to be mindful, like, what am I using this tool for? And how am I being used? If you're using a service and it's free, it's because you're the service, right? Like, you're the product, and your data is being mined, it's being gathered, it's being sold. And so we got to be careful. I mean, there's some really extraordinary documentaries about Facebook, The Great Hack, the Social Dilemma come to mind, that point out the way that we're actually being manipulated by some of these social media sites like Facebook. And I mean, not just because of the fake news that gets way too often, spread there, but our news feed is actually designed as an algorithm to present us with content we are inclined to like and engage. And that's how Facebook makes money, because it promises its advertisers that you are inclined to like what you see and engage it. So they can count on your eyeballs being glued to that screen. So I think we all have to do some work to kind of diversify our news feed and to figure out, okay, like, yes, these might be the articles that I agree with. These might be the friends that I see eye to eye with politically, but what would it be like to draw near virtually someone that I don't see eye to eye with, and not just get into a shouting match or trying to disprove each other, but to say, how can this be an opportunity for us to listen and learn from each other? I don't know how well Facebook or Twitter can actually do that, so that we get to listen and learn from each other. But I think that the advantage of things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram is that it is at least a very superficial way to share life together. For Jim and Cecilia to say, look at another beautiful Florida day, right? Like, and we get to share that with them. That's great, right? It should be the floor, not the ceiling of our interactions. And we have to be really careful that it supplements but doesn't replace our offline interactions with people. And I think that's what I'm worried about. Like, even, being a college professor and working on a college campus, I always ask my students if they enjoy Parents Weekend or when a parent visits, and they complain and they say, no, it was bad. My parents came, they wanted to take a selfie, and then they posted it on Facebook or Instagram, and then they just sat there staring at their screen, waiting for their friends to like and comment on their picture so that they can feel good about what kind of awesome parents they are because of how great their kid is doing at college. That's heartbreaking to hear my students that all they wanted was to enjoy that time with their parents, when their parents were fixated on, I need to prove to all my friends what a great parent I am. So I think that's what we got to worry about, the posturing, the filtering, these carefully curated profiles that we create to show everyone how great our life is. I mean, how can that not feed into the compare and despair dynamic? Because I'm comparing my life, all the behind the scenes mess that I would never show to anyone, with everyone else's carefully curated highlight reel, right? It makes me think that, like, something's wrong with me. So I think if we can really try to diversify who we follow, who we interact with, to always, offer some degree of respect and compassion, humility, curiosity. I think those are the kinds of traits we need to bring to social media, because it's a tool. It's not inherently good or bad. It's all how we use it and for what end, and that's up to us. But I think we do have to pay attention to why it's very often being used more as a wedge to divide, or to make people question their inherent dignity or their value, or to question if they belong, if they count, if they matter. And we've got to be more, I think, cognizant of the way that social media is using to hurt people, more than help them.
Yeah. Avoiding that echo chamber kind of mentality, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Right, where you're just presented with all the views that confirm your worldview.
I just a note, we one of the inspirations for Eat Chicken Be Catholic a long time ago was that I have a friend who's an atheist, and that was fascinating discussions with him. And I've invited him many times, and several people I know, and they don't come. But the idea was, it was just fascinating to me. Like, it was really interesting to see the other side, not because I don't wholly disagree, but that it was just an interesting debate. Sometimes we need to be in debate. You started out, they weren't hearing this about the what sometimes can be that compare and despair concept of the ins and outs of I am the way, the truth, and life. That was fascinating to me, because that can be a line in the sand for a lot of people when it's not supposed to be, right? And that was a great comment. If you wouldn't mind bringing that to tonight too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the impulse to exclusivism is something we have to pay attention to. If we think we're on the right side, or that God's on our side, and I feel badly about that, because going to Market High, I certainly was guilty of those chants at sporting events, the God's on our side. And that, boy, do I regret that. But I think we got to pay attention to what is that about, that impulse to exclusivism, to say, like, okay, I'm on the right side or the winning side. and to again try to look for the insecurity there, right? Like with Jewish people, like yes, that claim that they are the chosen people, that can be something for them that maybe has a little bit of an exclusivism. But in the same way, Christians aren't really much better if we don't see ourselves as, you know, indebted to our older brothers and sisters in the faith, right? Our Jewish brothers and sisters in the faith, and to see that we are indebted to their right relationship with God and the covenant that God established with them. And when people go to that line, John 14:6, and cherry pick it and say, well, you know, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, that you have to be Christian to be saved. We miss, as I was telling Sean before, what Jesus actually says. If you look at the Aramaic, that word I am, that's not Jesus pointing to himself as in like, you know, me, Jesus of Nazareth. He's using the exact same word that Yahweh uses when Moses asks at the burning bush, who should I say sent me, you know, to Pharaoh. And God's response is this neologism, this word that had never existed before, that is a to be verb. I mean, it's impossible to translate from the Hebrew to the English, but it's essentially I was, I am, and I will be, all in one word, right? That's the same word Jesus uses in John 14:6 to say, I am, God is the way, the truth, and the life, right? Like that God is more being in a self-giving love than a being. And so when we just cling to the, okay, well, I've accepted Jesus as my personal Lord and Savior, you know, that's not biblical. But it also then trends to that exclusivism that shuts us off from being attentive and awake to what God is up to outside of our tent, right? That the diversity in the human community is never something that we should fear or see as a threat, right? That there's no one way to be human. There's no one way to be a religious person, right? That religious diversity, as you know, is the case for many other different kinds of diversity. It's a divine gift and a divine blessing because it shows us that there's many ways to be human, and that God has given us the gift of this diversity so that we can learn from each other and celebrate each other, not, you know, be fearful or be threatened by those differences. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that I love about being a theologian, you know, is that theology is inquiry. It's investigation into the holy mystery we call God. And it means refusing to call a halt at any point, because the moment we say, aha, I figured it out, this is who God is, we've settled for something less than God, you know, that we've settled for an idol. And that's, I think, the invitation with the ethics of encounter is that we try to enlarge our imagination of what's possible in encountering other people and also being encountered by other people. How do I make myself more available to people who are not like me? How do I try to model some kind of authenticity and vulnerability and mutuality and equality? And trying to stretch our imagination of what's possible for us on the personal level, on the interpersonal level or the parish level, and then, you know, regionally or nationally, right? Like, I think that keeps us from settling for something less than what God makes possible through us.
All right, I have our first question from the chat box. Jim and Cecilia want to know, is this the first book? And what's next? So you don't get to just enjoy this. What's next? So I'm going to hold up the book so people can see it again. The Ethics of Encounter. If you want to, there you go. Yeah, Sean's got it too. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the process of writing it. Is it your first book, and do you have plans for another? What's the sequel? What's the Empire Strikes Back of the Ethics of Encounter?
Yeah, so this is my first book. It's the book that I've been wanting to write ever since that moment in the garbage dump when I was 17 and thinking about the way that I've been changed by encounters in my life. And I'm grateful that Pope Francis kind of gave me the idea for putting all these ideas together through his vision for building the culture of encounter. So that's where, you know, the book gets its title, The Ethics of Encounters, trying to figure out what does this look like in an American context. And that was my task, was to figure out, okay, Francis has been talking for the last 7.5 years about this need to build the culture of encounter. But what does that look like in the US when we are, you know, dealing with a lot of individualism, a lot of division by race and class, these echo chambers online that Sean referenced. And so that was kind of the task in front of me, was to look really with clear eyes at these instances of distrust and discord and division, and then to use the, you know, the story of the Samaritan as a way to kind of blow up those categories of us and them, and to try to figure out ways that we can encounter each other on a human level. So, I wanted to work through that and then figure out how do we figure out our moral obligations to people, which is the point of chapter 3. I'm least satisfied with chapter 3 because it's kind of like the most insider baseball, the kind of ethical realm. But that's where I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we honor our obligations to those nearest to us who rely on us the most, like friends and family, and those who are in the ditch that, might be really far away. And then 4 and 5 look at how we try to do this together in the inner work, but then also through relationships. Psychologists and sociologists tell us that people really aren't formed in a moral sense by beliefs or even by teaching. I mean, good thing Father Tim isn't here, but people don't remember sermons, and it really doesn't affect their moral compass, at least empirically. But people are formed by relationships. We are what we repeatedly do together. That's what has the highest degree of moral formation. And I see that in my own life. I mean, when I was born and raised Catholic, I could count on one hand how many times that I missed Sunday Mass before I went to college. It was just kind of like, well, this is who we are, this is what we do. It was our norm, and I didn't know anything else. And that was true for service and a lot of other things that now it's my job as a dad of 3 little ones to figure out, like, all right, how do I model this for and with my children? So that's the hope for the book, that it becomes kind of a way for us to think about how do we do this in families, how do we do this online, and then also the very end of the book is looking at how do we encounter the natural world and non-human creation, given that there's no planet B, right? And what Pope Francis did with Laudato Si to kind of bring awareness to the need for that ecological conversion and our commitment to the global common good, that's something that has to be on our radar too. To think about what we owe not only our present neighbors, but our future generations that don't have any other planet to call home. So yeah, that was, I mean, I wrote the book over the course of about a year, a little bit less than a year. I got a sabbatical so that I could focus on that and get a break from teaching, which was great. I don't know when I'll get a sabbatical again to write a second book, but the two areas that I'm focusing on right now are, the first is mental health. Mental health is a huge epidemic right now, especially among young people, as you may know. The mental illness rate in teen girls between 2009 and 2019 went up 50% in that 10-year period. And with teen boys, it went up 74%. So we are just at the tip of an iceberg in terms of mental illness. We're still trying to figure out what that's all about. And that was before the pandemic. And every study I've seen suggests that mental illness has only worsened in the pandemic because we have been disconnected from the people in our lives and our roles and relationships and our routines that can ground and center us. So that's the thing I want to explore further. But right now, my more immediate concern is I'm actually working on a research grant from Fordham University to study moral injury and the impact of the clergy abuse scandal and its cover-up. And so that's what I'm working on right now, is to figure out, as an ethicist and as a moral theologian, as someone who's very grateful to be a product of Catholic education and 14 years of Jesuit education, to figure out what are the depths and the dimensions of the woundedness in the wake of the clergy abuse scandal and its cover-up, right? That there were a lot of people who knew about what was going on and looked the other way or proceeded with business as usual, and what that's done to the church. I don't know if that'll turn into a book, but that's certainly going to be my focus for the next few years as I'm actually designing a tool right now to measure moral injury with a team that includes, a trauma-based theologian, a sociologist, and a psychologist, because all the studies of moral injury that we have to date really focus mostly on vets returning from war. And I think that the clergy abuse scandal is distinct, and there's a huge range of impact, not just among survivors and their friends and family, but among all Catholics. I know I can't tell you how many students of mine who have left the church, and it basically comes down to 3 things. It's the clergy abuse scandal, it's the marginalization of women, and it's the exclusion or the targeting of LGBTQ people. And for them, those make it really hard to imagine themselves as Catholic. So those are the kinds of things that I want to focus on and figure out, how do we rebuild a church that resembles the Jesus movement, that was, a band of misfits. Jesus was killed because of how he ate. This still boggles my mind. I think if Jesus were here today, no one would follow him. They would think he was an absolute lunatic, because he wouldn't just be eating with the sinners and the outcasts, like the people that we're supposed to feel sorry for. But he invites himself over to dinner to eat with Zacchaeus, who's a tax collector, right? The sellout, the Jewish man who's working with the Roman occupation, the empire that's oppressing the Jewish people. The fact that Jesus broke bread with people who weren't Jewish, that was unheard of in Jesus' day, right? Like the Jews were divided by their menus and their tables. And Jesus said, no, all are welcome. And I think we've got to find a way to model that kind of inclusion and hospitality and to become a community of co-equals. And I think that's really hard because we're living right now in a cultural context where we turn everything into a Yelp review, and if you don't like the homilies or the music here, then you don't go to that church. Or if you don't feel welcome, you find a place where you do. And for a lot of people, they're not finding that in a church anymore. So they're going to yoga or coffee shop or going for a walk with friends, right? Like they think of it as a consumer. I'm not getting what I want from this place, so I'm going to look somewhere where I can get what I want or what I need. But that misses the point, right? By virtue of baptism, this is your church just as much as it's my church, just as much as Father Tim's church or Pope Francis's church, right? Like this is our church, and we've got to find a way for people to kind of see themselves as the church and as responsible to each other in building a place that is welcoming for everyone, no exceptions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mary Jo asks, can you have Marcus discuss his view of non-dual thinking and its benefits to encountering the other?
Yeah, I think that's key. That's a great question. I think we do live in a world that very often gives us kind of these binaries of black and white, right or left, gay or straight, rich or poor, whatever it is. And the world is just far too complex for those simple binaries. So I appreciate the question. Yeah, we really do have to push beyond any of those simplistic ways of seeing the world. And I think because those become like security blankets, right? And ways to categorize us versus them. And I think just in the way that Jesus blew up that category of neighbor, that implies there's a non-neighbor. I think we have to blow up that kind of thinking that gets us to think in those categories of saint or sinner, worthy or unworthy, welcomer or unwelcome, and to see that, that's not reflective of reality.
Yeah, it's a big tent, and one of the things that we often hear that can be somewhat divisive too when you say it is that God's dream is that all will be one, and you go, no, well, yeah, all will be one, but not them, right? Like all will be one. Sure, yeah, everybody. You mean everybody? Yeah, no, everyone. That guy? No, everyone. All will be one. Like that the debate that we'd have with God. Like, are you sure they're involved? Tent's not big enough. No, everyone. Yeah, no exceptions. That's a really challenging thing these days.
But that's the whole point of the incarnation, right? Like that God takes human flesh, that there's not even a dualism between human and divine anymore, because
Mm-hmm.
God takes the human condition and makes it God's own. So that dualistic thinking, just we've got to take dynamite to it, right? Because God doesn't know what we're talking about. There's no sacred and profane. There is only sacred, and we've got to live like the truth is true.
Thanks, Marcus. I'm going to share my screen here to throw up a slide to invite us to next week's.
You're not going to throw up, are you, Chad?
I'm not going to throw up. Let me clarify that. Yeah.
Thank you. Good thing. That would not be important to do.
All right. Is that popping up for everybody?
Yep.
I did a quick Google search of Vincent, and I was very nice to him by giving you this picture, because if you've been at Eat, Drink, and Be Catholic before, I try to use the worst picture I can find online. So December 9th, Vincent's going to be speaking to us about a community of generosity. Many of you know Vincent from the River West Food Pantry. And I think you're going to hear a lot of parallels to what we were talking about tonight, this sense of mutuality and solidarity as opposed to charity as sort of a here we are giving to people down here. But I'm really excited to invite him. But I really want to thank Marcus for being with us tonight. I don't know, Sean, if you had any finishing comments before we sign off with a quick prayer. But I'm just really grateful for taking the time, both tonight, but also over the past couple months, getting together with us and answering my emails and giving me a reading assignment. I appreciate all that.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I think it just really, having to spend some time on your book and really getting a sense of sort of the devotion that you have not only to the people that came, the theologians that came before you, in a lot of the footnotes and the reverential way that you look at those mentors and people that have guided you. It just is so beautiful. And I just can't thank you enough. It's been great. Thanks.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very grateful.
So let's close in a prayer. We'll sign ourselves in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of love, you are a God of encounter. You come to us in so many different ways, and especially in the incarnation, you come to us in the person of Jesus. In our baptisms, we're called to now go and encounter all those that we meet. Help us to see what we can do and what we can't do, and focus on those ways in which we can bring your love to those who we encounter. Help us to see ways in which we can change our social location. Help us to see ways that we can find people to encounter who aren't normally on our path, so that we can go down into the ditch and be with those who need your love, your healing more than ever. And we ask this in all things through Christ our Lord. Amen. So again, everyone, thank you so much for being with us. If you know people who couldn't be with us tonight, but would appreciate this conversation, we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel, hopefully by tomorrow, and I'll send out an email once that's ready to go. But thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.